There was a day you stopped talking about your dreams out loud. Maybe you don't even remember which day it was. But somewhere along the way, after enough tired looks, enough "are you sure about this?" enough silence where support should have been, you learned to keep your plans quietly folded inside you, like something too fragile to survive another person's doubt. Maybe it wasn't even one dramatic conversation that taught you this. Maybe it was 100 small ones. A slightly raised eyebrow here, a slightly too long pause there, a joke that wasn't really a joke, repeated so gently and so often that you never even noticed yourself shrinking. One small silence at a time, until quietness simply became the safer, easier choice. You started explaining yourself instead, justifying why you're still trying, why you're still learning, why, at your age, in your situation, with everything already stacked against you, you refuse to just accept the life you were handed. And every single time you explained yourself, a small part of you died a little, because deep down, you knew something painful. Explaining yourself to people who never truly believed in you was never going to change their minds. It was only going to exhaust yours. So here's what I need you to hear today, clearly, because you may not hear it again for a long time. You do not owe anyone an explanation for choosing to grow. Not your family, not your friends, not the version of yourself that gave up before, who still whispers doubt into your ear late at night. You don't owe silence a defense. You owe yourself a future. Stop explaining. Start becoming. Let your silence build something so undeniable, so real, that one day, the very people who doubted you, who laughed quietly, who never said it to your face but believed it anyway, will watch you and feel nothing but shock. Not because you proved a point, because you simply stopped needing to. This is your wake-up call. Not tomorrow, not when you feel ready. Now, in this exact moment, while the fire is still burning, however small it feels, focus only on yourself, your growth, your English, your future, and let your results do what your words never could. This is English Master Path, and today isn't just about grammar, or vocabulary, or practice habits. Today is about the one shift that has to happen before any of that even matters. The shift from performing your growth for other people to actually building it quietly for yourself. Everything else we teach here, the daily habits, the speaking drills, the small consistent practice, only works once this deeper shift is already in place. Because no technique survives long against a mind still waiting for someone else's permission to keep going. Let me tell you about a young woman named Farah. She grew up in a house where dreams were treated like luxuries other people got to have, not people like her. Every time she mentioned wanting to speak English fluently, wanting a different kind of job, wanting a different kind of life, someone in the room would gently, kindly, almost lovingly, remind her to be realistic. Nobody was cruel about it. That was the hardest part. It wasn't rejection. It was quiet, well-meaning doubt, repeated so often that eventually she started doubting herself before anyone else even had the chance to. She remembers one dinner in particular, nothing dramatic, just an ordinary evening, where she mentioned a free English course she'd found online. An older relative smiled warmly and said, "That's nice, but you should focus on more practical things." Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. The conversation simply moved on to something else, as if the idea had already quietly been filed away as unrealistic before it had even had a chance to breathe. Farah smiled too, and said nothing more about it that night, though something small inside her had already started to shrink. That same scene repeated itself, with small variations, more times than she could count over the following years. A cousin's wedding, a casual conversation over tea, a phone call with a distant relative asking about her plans. Each time, the same gentle, well-meaning redirection. Each time, the same small shrinking she got used to not noticing anymore, until it had quietly become part of how she introduced her own dreams to herself. Already apologetic, already bracing for doubt before anyone had even responded. For years, Farooq did what most people do in that situation. She explained herself. She defended her choices at family dinners. She justified her small English lessons to people who thought her time would be better spent elsewhere. She argued for her own future, over and over, to people who had already quietly decided what her future was supposed to look like. And every argument, whether she won it or not, left her a little more tired, a little more convinced that maybe she really was asking for too much. The strange part, she later said, was that she almost never lost these arguments outright. She was articulate, patient, reasonable. She could usually explain her reasoning well enough that the conversation ended without conflict. But winning the argument never actually changed anything. The doubt would simply return quietly a few weeks later, in a slightly different form, and she'd find herself explaining all over again, as if convincing people once was never actually going to be enough. Because the real issue was never the argument itself. Looking back, she realized the doubt she kept arguing against was never really about English at all. It was about a much older, much deeper fear people close to her carried. The fear of watching someone they loved reach for something bigger and possibly fail, or possibly succeed and grow into someone they no longer fully recognized. Understanding that didn't make the doubt easier to hear, but it did make it easier to stop taking personally, and easier, eventually, to stop needing to argue against at all. One evening, after another exhausting conversation where she found herself defending, once again, why she was still trying to learn English at all, something inside her simply went quiet, not defeated, something closer to finished. Finished explaining, finished convincing, finished asking, silently, for permission she was never going to receive from people who couldn't yet see what she was capable of becoming. She made a decision that night that had nothing dramatic about it on the surface. She stopped announcing her plans, not out of secrecy or shame, but because she finally understood something most people learn far too late. Explaining a dream to someone who doesn't believe in it rarely changes their mind. It only gives them more opportunities to accidentally, quietly chip away at yours. She didn't tell anyone about this decision either, which felt fitting somehow. A quiet choice made entirely for herself, about herself, without needing anyone else's approval of the decision itself. The next morning felt strange, lighter in a way she couldn't quite explain, as if she'd set down a bag she hadn't realized she'd been carrying for years. One filled entirely with other people's opinions about what she was allowed to want. Opinions she'd been quietly hauling around for so long, she'd forgotten they were never actually hers to carry in the first place. Here's the first shift, and it's the one almost nobody makes on purpose. Stop announcing your goals before you've built anything real to show for them. This isn't about hiding your growth forever. It's about protecting it while it's still small, fragile, and easily discouraged by other people's doubt, even well-meaning doubt, even doubt disguised as concern. Think about what actually happens when you announce a big goal too early. You get a small hit of social recognition, a few nods, a few kind words, sometimes a few doubts disguised as advice. And that small hit of recognition can quietly trick your brain into feeling like you've already made progress, when really, nothing has happened yet except talking. Silence removes that trap completely. When no one knows what you're building, there's no audience to perform for, only the actual work left to do. There's a specific psychological reason this works, one worth understanding rather than simply trusting. The part of your brain that seeks approval doesn't always distinguish clearly between announcing an intention and actually completing it. Both can feel, briefly, like accomplishment. Removing the announcement removes that false sense of completion entirely. leaving only the real thing behind, the actual practice, the actual sentence spoken, the actual page written, with nothing left to substitute for it, and nothing left to hide behind either. Practice this tonight. Choose one small English goal, learning 10 new words, having one real conversation, finishing one lesson, and tell absolutely no one about it beforehand. Just do it, quietly, and notice how different that feels from announcing it first. Notice how the motivation has to come from somewhere else now, somewhere steadier than other people's approval, somewhere that doesn't disappear the moment nobody happens to be watching or praising you for the effort. Now pause for a moment, honestly, and think about your own habit here. When you have a goal, is your first instinct to tell someone about it, or to quietly begin working on it? There's no wrong answer, only useful information about which shift matters most for you tonight. We've covered the first shift, staying quiet while you build. Now let's talk about something almost every learner feels but rarely names honestly. The exhausting habit of comparing your progress to everyone else's. Farah struggled badly with this in the beginning. She'd see other learners online, speaking confidently after what looked like a few short months, and feel a familiar, sinking sense of falling behind, as if there were some invisible schedule everyone else was following perfectly except her. That feeling didn't motivate her. It quietly drained her, night after night, until opening her notebook started to feel less like hope and more like another reminder of how far she still had to go.
A learner named Basira felt something similar, though her comparison came from a different direction. A coworker who had studied English for half the time, yet somehow spoke with far more confidence. Basira spent months quietly resenting that difference, assuming something was simply wrong with her own ability, before realizing that confidence and duration of study were never the same thing at all.
Her coworker had simply stopped comparing much earlier, which freed up energy Basira had been spending on comparison instead of practice. Here's the second shift. Comparison isn't actually the problem. Comparison aimed at the wrong target is the problem. Comparing yourself to a stranger's highlight reel measures the wrong thing entirely. Their showcased success against your private, ordinary struggle. But comparing this week's version of yourself to last month's version, that comparison actually tells you something true, something useful, something entirely within your control. Try this. Instead of asking, "Am I as good as that person yet?" ask, "Am I better than I was 30 days ago?" Even a small yes, a slightly longer conversation, a slightly smaller pause before speaking, a slightly calmer feeling before a new lesson, counts as real, measurable progress. Say this with me, out loud, as your new comparison rule. I only compete with who I was yesterday. Say it again. I only compete with who I was yesterday, not with a stranger's highlight reel, not with someone else's timeline, only with the version of me that existed before today. This matters because your nervous system responds completely differently to these two comparisons. One creates shame, and shame quietly convinces you to quit. The other creates direction, and direction keeps you moving forward. One honest, private improvement at a time, regardless of how anyone else's journey happens to look from the outside. One mistake to avoid here. Don't swing to the opposite extreme and refuse to ever look at anyone else's progress at all. Watching a more advanced speaker occasionally can still teach you something useful. The problem was never observation. It was measurement. Quietly using someone else's timeline as if it were the only correct schedule your own progress was supposed to follow. We've covered staying quiet and comparing only against your own past. Now let's talk about what to actually do with all that redirected energy. Because silence alone isn't a strategy. It's just the space where a real strategy finally gets room to work. The third shift is building what I'll call silent proof. Small pieces of evidence, visible only to you, that prove your growth is real, even before anyone else notices it. Farah started keeping a small, private notebook. Not for grammar rules, but for tiny wins nobody else would ever see. The day she understood a full conversation without translating. The day she ordered coffee in English without rehearsing it first. The day she caught herself thinking a full thought in English before switching back to her first language. None of these moments would have impressed anyone watching from the outside. That was never the point. Each one was proof, addressed only to herself, that the quiet work was actually working. Even on days when nothing around her seemed to have changed at all. Even on the ordinary, forgettable days that rarely make it into anyone's version of a success story, she kept that notebook hidden in a drawer, separate from the vocabulary notebook everyone in her family already knew about. This one was different, private in a way that had nothing to do with secrecy for its own sake, and everything to do with protecting something fragile and new from outside opinions, even well-meaning ones, until it had grown strong enough to withstand them. Strong enough that no passing comment could shake it loose again. Here's the practice. Tonight, and every night going forward, write down one small win from your day, however tiny it feels. Not a grade, not someone else's compliment. Something you noticed yourself, privately, that proves you're moving forward. This isn't about tracking perfection. It's about building a private, undeniable record that quietly outlasts your own doubt on the days it inevitably shows up again. And it will show up again, more than once, no matter how far you've already come. Over time, that small notebook becomes something far more powerful than motivation ever was. Motivation fades the moment life gets difficult. Evidence doesn't. When you're tired, unmotivated, and questioning whether any of this is actually working, you won't need to feel inspired again. You'll simply open the notebook and remember, in your own handwriting, that it already is. There's something worth naming here about why this particular practice works so well against doubt. Doubt thrives on vagueness, on the fuzzy, unprovable feeling that maybe nothing is really changing. A written record removes that vagueness completely. You can't argue with a date and a sentence describing exactly what you noticed. Doubt has nothing solid left to attack once evidence exists in your own handwriting, collected over weeks, impossible to quietly explain away. We've covered silence, honest comparison, and private evidence. Now let's talk about the moment all of this quietly starts to become visible to everyone else too. Whether you intended it to or not, the fourth shift is letting your results speak. Eventually, without you needing to explain a single thing. Farah didn't announce the day she finally spoke fluently in a real meeting for the first time. She didn't need to. The people around her simply noticed, gradually, that the person who used to stay quiet in group conversations was now speaking clearly, calmly, without visibly searching for words the way she once had. A colleague, without ever knowing about the notebooks, the years of quiet doubt, or the deliberate silence, once commented offhandedly that Farah seemed different lately, more confident, somehow. Farah simply smiled and said thank you, without offering any explanation at all, because for the first time, none was needed. The results were already speaking on their own, in a language doubt had no answer for. Here's the truth nobody tells you about this moment. It rarely arrives as one dramatic breakthrough. It arrives as a slow accumulation of 100 small, private choices, finally becoming visible all at once. The way a plant that's been growing quietly underground finally breaks through the surface, seemingly overnight. Even though the real work happened long before anyone could see it, you don't control when other people notice your growth. You only control whether the growth is real enough, eventually, for them to have no choice but to notice it. That's the entire shift from asking people to believe you to simply becoming someone their doubt can no longer explain away. This is often the hardest shift to trust because it asks you to keep investing quietly for weeks or months without any external proof that anyone has noticed yet. That waiting period is exactly where most people quit. right before the visible part, convinced that because no one has commented on their progress yet, no real progress must be happening. Farah felt this too, more than once, staring at her small notebook of private wins, wondering if any of it actually mattered if no one else could see it. It did. It always does. The seeing simply comes later than the growing, sometimes far later, and learning to trust that gap without needing constant reassurance is, in many ways, the real test this entire shift is asking of you. Small steps, real progress. This is where most people stop, right before the part that actually changes everything. Don't stop, especially not on the days when no one seems to be watching, because those are exactly the days that quietly decide everything. Now let's bring all 4 shifts together into one simple approach you can start tonight. Stop announcing your goals before you've built something real. Compare only against who you were yesterday, never against someone else's highlight reel. Keep a private record of small, honest wins nobody else needs to see. And trust that your results, eventually, will speak far louder and far more convincingly than any explanation you could ever give. Let's imagine what this actually looks like over an ordinary week. Monday, you quietly decide to practice 10 minutes of speaking without telling anyone. Wednesday, instead of scrolling through someone else's fluent video and feeling behind, you compare tonight's 5 sentences to last week's 3 and notice the difference. Friday, you write one small line in your private notebook. I understood a joke in English without translating it first. By Sunday, nothing dramatic has happened on the surface. No announcement, no applause, just 4 small, private choices, quietly stacking on top of each other, exactly the way real change actually happens. Multiply that single week by a full month, and you begin to see how this actually adds up. 4 Mondays of quiet practice, 4 moments of honest self-comparison instead of exhausting comparison to strangers, 4 small lines of private evidence sitting together in a notebook nobody else has read. None of it looks impressive from the outside, not yet. But from the inside, something real has already started shifting, long before anyone else is close enough to notice it. A second learner, a man named Idris, described this same process differently. He said the hardest part wasn't the practice itself, it was resisting the urge to post about it, to tell people, to seek some kind of outside confirmation that he was doing the right thing. Once he stopped needing that confirmation, he said, the practice itself became almost peaceful, something done entirely for its own sake, rather than performed for an audience that was never actually going to validate it the way he hoped, no matter how much praise they eventually offered once the results finally became impossible to ignore. Farah still remembers the exact moment her mother finally said something different, months after all the quiet arguments had stopped completely. They were watching a video together, and Farah translated a difficult sentence out loud, without thinking, without hesitation, the way you translate something in your own first language. Her mother went quiet for a moment, then said simply, "When did this happen?" Farah didn't have a dramatic answer. She just said, slowly, "I think it's been happening the whole time." There was no big speech in that moment, no dramatic reconciliation, no apology exchanged for years of quiet doubt, just a small, ordinary pause in an ordinary evening, where something shifted quietly between them, unspoken but completely understood. Her mother didn't need to say she'd been wrong to worry. Farah didn't need to say she'd been right to keep going anyway. The moment simply spoke for both of them, in a way months of arguing never once had. That's what shock everyone actually means, not a performance, not a dramatic reveal, not proving anyone wrong on purpose. It's the quiet, almost accidental moment when people realize the person in front of them has already become someone they no longer fully recognize, built entirely out of private evenings nobody applauded at the time. Notice how different this version of shocking everyone is from the one most people imagine. Most people picture a dramatic reveal, A moment where they announce their success loudly and watch everyone's jaws drop on cue. Real transformation almost never works that way. It happens sideways, quietly, in an ordinary moment nobody planned for. A translated sentence, a calm answer to a hard question, a conversation that used to feel impossible now feeling completely normal. The shock isn't a performance you deliver. It's simply what happens when doubt finally runs out of evidence to stand on, replaced instead by a version of you it never quite expected to meet. If you've spent years explaining yourself to people who were never going to fully understand until they saw it for themselves, I want you to release that exhausting habit tonight. You were never required to convince anyone. You were only ever required to keep going, quietly, consistently, on your own terms, for your own future. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from spending your energy on convincing instead of building. And if you've been carrying it for a long time, you might not even recognize how heavy it's become. Because it's been there so long, it started to feel normal. Imagine, just for a moment, redirecting all of that energy, every explanation you've ever given, every argument you've ever made for your own worth, straight into the quiet work itself instead. That redirected energy alone, without adding anything new, is often enough to completely change how fast you actually grow. Think about how much of your life has quietly been spent defending a choice instead of simply making it. Every minute spent explaining is a minute not spent practicing, not spent speaking, not spent becoming the version of yourself doubt insists you'll never reach. You cannot get those minutes back, but you can decide, starting tonight, that no more of them will be spent that way. Tonight, choose one small English goal and tell no one about it. Just do it. Let it be the first entry in evidence only you will ever need to see. Tell me in the comments, which of these 4 shifts do you think you need most right now? Staying quiet about your goals, comparing only to your past self, keeping private proof, or simply trusting your results to eventually speak for themselves? And if you've ever felt exhausted from explaining yourself to people who were never really listening, tell me that too. Because that exhaustion is far more common and far more understandable than most people ever admit out loud. And naming it honestly is often the first real step toward finally setting it down. If this reached something real in you today, subscribe to English Master Path. We build real speaking confidence here, quietly, consistently, through small habits that eventually speak louder than any explanation ever could. You don't owe anyone your reasons anymore. You only owe yourself your effort. Focus only on yourself tonight, and let everyone else catch up later, when there's finally something undeniable for them to see, something no explanation could have ever built as well as quiet. Consistent action already has. One small evening at a time, long before anyone else thought to notice.